1 minute ago, everything changed. As I speak to you now, Britain is no longer the same country it was when you woke up this morning. A royal emergency has been declared. Parliament is in turmoil. Military protocols are being reviewed in real time. And what triggered this sudden nationwide shock? An uncompromising, clear ultimatum by Vladimir Putin, conveyed via private diplomatic channels and confirmed to us by 3 separate sources within the Foreign Office. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. Because what King Charles did in response, Jan, and what transpired next inside the Royal Command Centre at Sandringham, Jan, has left political insiders, defence analysts, and even seasoned intelligence operatives utterly speechless. We are seeing a moment of geopolitical brinkmanship, unlike anything in recent British history. A confrontation of a wounded superpower and a weakened monarchy playing out in real time, with the fate of an entire nation hanging precariously in the balance. But before I tell you what was in Putin's message, and trust me, you need to hear this, you need to understand the chain of events that led to this historic rupture. Because none of this happened by accident. This was a calculated move, orchestrated to hit Britain at its most vulnerable, right now, when domestic divisions, energy instability, and royal uncertainty have created the perfect storm. This is not a drill. And according to sources inside Milo, this isn't over. It's just beginning. To understand the sheer magnitude of what just happened and why King Charles is now at the centre of a global crisis, you need to go back just Sishabas al-Shiraz. Because, as one senior intelligence analyst I spoke to just this morning put it, what happened today was not a spontaneous act of aggression. It was part of a broader strategic offensive months in the making. It began quietly. A series of cyber attacks on UK infrastructure, then dismissed by the government as technical anomalies. A sudden drop in gas supply from Russian Dan-linked pipelines. A mysterious blackout at RF Menwith Hill, Britain's most important surveillance hub. All brushed aside in press briefings, all dismissed as isolated incidents. But behind the scenes, royal and government security councils were going berserk. And then came the warning signs from the Kremlin, cryptic diplomatic messages, increasingly hostile language in the Russian state media, and most chillingly, an intercepted communication between 2 senior Russian generals reportedly discussing severe leverage over the British monarchy. That phrase, severe leverage, triggered a level C alert inside GCHQ. But here's the kicker. Nobody anticipated. Putin wasn't targeting the Prime Minister. He wasn't aiming at Parliament. His message was addressed to King Charles III directly. A message sent via a secure back-channel to Buckingham Palace late last night. A message that allowed no room for bargaining, no elbow room for diplomacy, and no consideration for protocol. If Britain continues to escalate its involvement in Eastern European defence operations, the note reads, Russia will disclose what your government and your family have been trying to hide for decades. One palace aide, speaking to me on strict condition of anonymity, described the note as the most personal and chilling communication the king has received since his coronation. But what could Putin have that would shake the royal family into silence? We'll get to that. But first, we need to take a look at what transpired within the palace walls just moments after receipt of that message. The message arrived via a hand-delivered diplomatic pouch at Schaffen, London time. Within 10 minutes, the king was awake, seated in his private briefing chamber inside Sandringham House, flanked only by his chief private secretary, the Lord Chamberlain, and 2 unnamed security officials. As sources confirm, no cabinet members were informed at first, not even the Prime Minister. But what Charles read in that message wasn't just a foreign policy threat, it was a personal threat with disturbing specificity. One of the sources described His Majesty's reaction as visibly disturbed but icily focused. He didn't panic. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then in a low voice, he reportedly said, "This must be contained immediately." What followed was a royal activation protocol known internally as Winter Shield. Very few outside the palace know this exists. It is an emergency response plan devised in the Cold War for whenever the monarch is directly threatened by a hostile foreign actor. Once activated, it initiates a temporary freeze on non-Zen essential royal travel encryption of all internal palace communications and, most importantly, a direct line opened with the UK's Shadow Emergency Council that counselled Zen. Normally dormant, Jan includes Mem Mai Liu, GCHQ, and a royal liaison from the Ministry of Defence. And what they discovered within hours of Putin's ultimatum is what changed everything, because the Russians weren't bluffing. They had something that could destabilize not only the government, but the monarchy itself. Something buried in classified Cold War era archives. A cache of documents, pictures and recordings purports to implicate members of the royal household in clandestine diplomatic activities run off the books during the Iten Jobai Bashamas and early Joshamaus. Operations which, if publicly known, could raise grave constitutional questions about the neutrality of the crown. According to sources close to the Russian state media, the Kremlin is ready to release everything if certain military activities in the Baltics are stopped right now. But here is where the story turns from dramatic to utterly historic. Because just 2 hours after this secret meeting finished, King Charles gave the order that is now sent shockwaves through every institution in the country. Initiate emergency domestic lockdown protocols. What does that mean? And why would the king trigger a lockdown when the government hasn't? The answer lies in ancient royal authority. The powers that most don't know still exist, and Charles just used them. What King Charles invoked in the pre-dawn hours is what constitutional experts call the Regency Emergency Clause, a little known, deeply buried mechanism of British royal authority, unwritten and rarely discussed. It essentially dates back to those post-Gen war years when the monarch was truly considered the last line of defence in case of some sort of existential national threat. Today, it is largely symbolic, with provisions that are rarely, if ever, used granting the reigning monarch some non-gen legislative emergency powers, particularly when threats are considered governmental, meaning they operate outside the normal political processes and thus constitute a plausible direct threat to the monarchy or state sovereignty itself. According to an internal palace source I spoke to just Joseph and John Utes ago, the clause was last updated during the height of the Cold War in Yitsenjo by Bashaliu, when fears of Soviet blackmail against the royal household became a real concern. Now, in Nauntenin Arshawu, for the first time in British history, it has been invoked. The clause allowed King Charles to authorise an immediate soft lockdown, particularly around military installations, government communication networks and key cultural heritage sites, all of which have since been moved to level red security protocols. This includes temporary closure of access to Whitehall, a rapid lockdown of Windsor Castle, and a mysterious grounding of all flights in and out of RAF Norfolk, a facility used for sensitive government and royal transport. Most strikingly, a classified memo leaked within the last hour reveals that the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Command has been redirected to heightened risk profiles, meaning they are now operating under a model usually reserved for terror threats or state collapse scenarios. But here is the kicker that has set legal and political worlds abuzz. King Charles issued this directive without consulting Parliament, and legally, insofar as the Regency Clause applies, he did not have to do so. One constitutional barrister described it as a shocking but technically lawful reassertion of sovereign power in the face of a national threat. The lockdown procedure was initiated, yet the Prime Minister's office was not notified until Sishatifenjong Utes later, according to several accounts from insiders. When aides rushed to inform the PM Zen, who was on a call with NATO officials at the time, his response was reportedly stunned silence, followed by a single phrase: "He did what?" What is unfolding now is not just a security emergency. It is a full blown constitutional collision, modern democratic governance pitted against ancient royal authority. It's an unthinkable moment wherein the head of state moved faster than the head of government. And while no shoe mouth crumbles to project calm, what is happening behind closed doors tells a very different story, according to one source present on a hastily arranged Cabinet Security Committee call. panic has now turned to paralysis. Intelligence chiefs are demanding immediate clarity on the depth of penetration by Russian operatives into royal networks, with ministers debating whether this crisis meets the threshold for temporary martial measures. But the most explosive development to come out today, Jen, and arguably all week, Jen, so far, does not come from those with classified briefings, but rather an unexpected quarter, a former Russian diplomat who defected to the West back in in an explosive interview aired just minutes ago. On a pan-European news outlet, he claimed the real reason behind Putin's ultimatum is not military positioning, but it is personal. He alleges that Russia has in its possession classified surveillance footage captured via satellite and compromised UK communication systems of a private royal meeting held during Queen Elizabeth II's final year, in which certain discussions about foreign influence, resource deals and wartime neutrality were held off the record. If true, and if released, these recordings could throw not just this government, but the entire monarchy into a legitimacy crisis unlike anything in British history. So now we are left with one burning question. Is this a chess move by Putin to fracture the West from within, or is it something even darker? A final act of global psychological warfare designed to obliterate the very idea of trust in power. Whatever the answer, one thing is absolutely clear. Britain is no longer watching history. It is living through it. Tours King Charles didn't react the way the world expected. And what he did next has triggered a national security response the British public has never seen before. By 8:15 a.m. this morning, the streets of central London began to empty. Not because the public was afraid, but because operational lockdowns quietly rolled out across 9 key boroughs. There was no official statement, no public press conference, no emergency broadcast, just a series of sudden closures, underground stations sealed, bridges restricted, and a growing police presence armed not just with sidearms, but full tactical gear across social media. Videos began flooding in. A woman in Westminster filmed 2 unmarked military vehicles parked near Parliament Square, their drivers silent, refusing to answer questions. A shopkeeper near Victoria posted footage of soldiers entering a side entrance to a government building at 6:47 a.m, unusual for a Tuesday, deeply alarming now. For the average British citizen, it was confusion wrapped in silence. Why were major parts of the capital suddenly off limits? Why were civil servants being sent home under vague infrastructure risk advisories? And why were schools in the Richmond, Westminster and Camden areas receiving alerts marked Category C, Royal Continuity Protocol? What the public didn't know then, but what I can confirm is that these alerts formed part of a classified continuity of monarchy plan, rarely even acknowledged outside of intelligence circles. Referred to internally as Operation Palladium, it is designed to protect the line of succession, ensure the secure relocation of key royal figures, and in the worst case, temporarily transfer command authority to a pre-selected group of royal military liaisons. That is not just ceremonial, that is an emergency structure for governing the country in the event of a complete breakdown in political command. And here is the part that should send chills down every spine. Palladium was activated at 5:42 a.m. Stop for a second. And consider that the British monarchy, supposed to be symbolic, ceremonial, and apolitical, has invoked the contingency framework that allows them to influence or override government command in a national emergency. And this is no longer theory, it is happening right now. Meanwhile, inside number 10, the Prime Minister was preparing to hold an emergency broadcast to address the nation, but multiple sources tell me that he was advised against going live by his own communications director, citing concerns that public exposure at this moment would escalate instability. The PM is being hidden, not by threat, but by strategy. They're terrified the public might read the panic on his face, and they should be. Because behind the polished glass walls of Whitehall, there is no script for what to do when your own king bypasses you and your greatest geopolitical rival is threatening to release decades-old secrets that could destroy the credibility of the crown. And just as the government was struggling to find a message, the Kremlin delivered one of their own at exactly 7:03 a.m. Russian state media issued a formal bulletin quoting a confidential intelligence source as saying that the British monarchy had been compromised by clandestine agreements made during the post-Soviet transition, and warned that unless NATO fully halts its naval activity in the Baltic by midnight GMT, the documents, now referred to ominously as the Scepter Files, would be published in full. The bulletin closed with one line now being translated and shared across every major media network. Your king has forgotten the cost of secrets, we will remind him. In 22 minutes, number Scepter Files was trending worldwide. BBC, Sky News, CNN, Al Jazeera. Every outlet was now on high alert, but none could confirm what those files contained. Only one outlet, a German investigative platform, claimed to have received a partial cache of the document. Their lead editor posted a single blurred image on X that appeared to show a royal crest atop a redacted intelligence memorandum dated 1992, with the phrase, A's only fade dual channel consent stamped in Soviet lettering. Though unverified, the internet exploded. Theories spiraled. Commentators scrambled, but one message rang louder than the rest. This is no longer about diplomacy, it's about survival. And what of the British public? They are now left suspended in a moment of profound uncertainty. Trains have ceased to run, schools are closing, supermarkets are experiencing surges in demand for essentials, and the king, the man they only just began to accept as the face of modern monarchy, has gone completely silent, except he hasn't. Now, sources within Sandringham have confirmed that King Charles is to address the nation tonight at 9 p.m, not through Downing Street, not via government press office, but via a pre-recorded broadcast filmed within royal grounds and unauthorised by Parliament. According to 3 insiders who previewed the transcript, it contains one sentence that could change Britain forever. By midday, what had started out as isolated lockdowns across military corridors and royal properties had expanded into something much broader and more coordinated. Without any formal televised address, without even so much as a government issued SMS, Britain had entered a state of emergency lockdown in everything but name. Roads leading to central government buildings were barricaded. Civilian drones were grounded. Airspace over parts of London, Birmingham and Glasgow was suddenly classified as restricted, with RAF Typhoon jets scrambled in what sources call symbolic deterrent patrols. On the ground, confusion turned to unrest. In Manchester, video footage shows commuters stuck outside of closed tram stations, demanding answers from visibly uninformed police officers. In Leeds, New Hampshire, workers were escorted off of hospital grounds due to data integrity threats, a term completely unfamiliar to both staff and press. The Crown Prosecution Service's online portal quietly went offline around 11:22 a.m, and journalists attempting to contact civil servants were either met with automated responses or deadlines. A news blackout had begun, but the streets were still watching people turn to social media, and what they found there only amplified their fear. Footage leaked by a whistleblower inside the Royal Protection Command now shows King Charles boarding a private royal transport helicopter at 5:56 a.m, accompanied not by the usual palace staff, but by plainclothes personnel with military escort codes discreetly embroidered on their sleeves. This wasn't a routine relocation. Something else was happening, something darker. The helicopter was tracked to land at a remote section of the Sandringham estate, which had been under total lockdown since the previous night. Every known journalist on the royal beat confirmed the same disturbing fact. The king had effectively disappeared from public life during the greatest constitutional crisis of his reign. But it wasn't just the monarch. Downing Street said nothing. At 12:06 p.m, the official Number 10 Twitter account tweeted a 2-line statement. The Prime Minister has been fully briefed on all development. A coordinated response with international allies is underway. The public will be updated shortly. That update never came. A series of cabinet members were spotted entering a secure mod location in Whitehall, but none of the PM's team emerged to speak to press. One parliamentary insider texted a political editor simply, "We've lost control of the narrative and the palace isn't answering calls." It wasn't just political chaos, but total breakdown in the chain of command. The consequences mounted by the hour. Markets reacted violently. The FTSE 100 plunged 6.4% by lunchtime. Sterling dropped to its lowest since Brexit referendum night. major UK-based multinationals began freezing transactions. In a leaked internal email, a senior HSBC risk analyst wrote, "We are operating in uncharted constitutional territory. Our risk models do not cover simultaneous monarchical and parliamentary instability." Even the Bank of England remained uncharacteristically quiet. No statement, no rate update, no economic reassurance, just silence. Meanwhile, outside Buckingham Palace, something symbolic and shocking was underway. The royal standard flag, which flew whenever the monarch was in residence, had been quietly lowered. In its place, the Union Jack was flying at half-mast. It wasn't a death, it was a signal. Flying the national flag at half-mast over the palace in times of constitutional crisis is a historically coded gesture to signal loss of order or sovereign coherence. That it should have been allowed, perhaps ordered, is a sign of how deep the rot has reached inside the establishment. By now, global reactions were flooding in. The White House issued a carefully worded statement urging calm and transparency while avoiding any reference to the monarchy. NATO's General Secretary called for unity among allies and strategic patience. France's president postponed a joint summit with the UK and called for clarity from London on matters of sovereignty. Even the Vatican issued a cryptic message during its morning mass about the consequences of building kingdoms on deception. But the people of Britain were left in the dark. The question echoed over and over again inside homes, cafes, schools and workplaces alike. What exactly did Putin threaten, and why is our government so terrified of the truth? It was coming, and if leaked talking points prepared for emergency briefings were to be believed, it would arrive in the form of a pre-recorded broadcast from King Charles himself, airing at 9 p.m. sharp, unfiltered, uncensored, and outside the government's control. But as daylight faded and the fear deepened, another development shattered the little sense of order that remained. A new leak, this time not from Moscow, but from inside Britain. A cache of files dropped onto a decentralized public server titled Only Scepter Archive UK Origin. And what it contained would shake the palace and the public to its core. At 5:17 p.m, in the maelstrom of speculation online about what the king was about to say, a new digital file appeared on an open access blockchain ledger, uploaded not from Russia, but from an IP address traced to Southwark, London, no more than 3 miles from Parliament itself. It was called simply Scepter Archive UK Origin. Unlike the earlier Kremlin drops, this was no bluff, no anonymous tease, no unverifiable ghost document. This was British-sourced, verified, authenticated, signed. Within 12 minutes, it had been mirrored across more than 3,000 servers worldwide. What was inside made even hardened analysts stagger. It was an archive of 91 separate documents, emails, voice memos, diplomatic cables, and briefing slides, all tagged between 1988 and 2010. The contents not only confirmed much of what the Kremlin had threatened to reveal, but went further, so much further. A classified transcript from March 1993 marked for Monarch Eyes Only described a meeting between a then senior royal advisor and 2 representatives from a Russian energy consortium. The discussion covered non-public facilitation of mineral rights transitions, with payment described as philanthropic funding routed through Anglo charitable institutions. In plain words, a quiet, deniable deal, brokered under the radar, in which post-Soviet energy assets would get Western legitimacy, and in return, select British elite figures would get generational benefit streams, masters' donations, patronages, or legacy, and the signature below the agreement. Initialed only as C, widely believed to refer to then Prince Charles. Zone of these audio memos was dated 2004 and included a voice very closely resembling that of a senior royal today, saying, "If these back-channel arrangements ever come to light, they'll say we compromise the institution for energy security." Another responded, "Number we saved the realm, the public will never know. This will all be buried by the time the crown passes." But it wasn't buried, it is here now. Every file, every memo, every whispered deal. And suddenly, Putin's threat started to look less like blackmail and more like a carefully timed exposure of secrets Britain never thought it would have to face. Worse still, the leaker didn't stop with palace documents. Included among them was a redacted MI6 internal briefing from 2012, warning of a high-risk entanglement between the royal household and non-state economic actors. It outlined fears that if such connections were ever revealed, it could trigger domestic constitutional turbulence with unpredictable public response. Translation: MI6 knew for over a decade, and so did at least 2 prime ministers. One of them is still alive. The file drop also included an encrypted conversation log from 2020 showing a discussion between legal advisors within the Crown estate regarding possible preemptive contingency language in the event of retroactive scrutiny of early 90s investments. The catchphrase repeated several times: Scepter exposure risk mitigation. The same term now being chanted in protests erupting across the UK. Over 2,000 people marched in Bristol carrying signs that said, "Not my king, not my truth." Outside Holyrood in Edinburgh, former veterans stood silently outside with placards reading, "I serve the Crown, not its secrets." In London, Westminster was now under partial police cordon as Parliament prepared for an emergency night session. The first since the pandemic. MPs from all parties had been recalled, not to vote on legislation, not to issue sanctions, but to confront a question no one in modern British history has dared to ask: what happens when the monarchy is no longer above suspicion? According to sources, several backbench MPs will table a motion inside the chamber calling for a Royal Transparency Commission, the first ever inquiry into the monarchy's financial and diplomatic history. But more explosively, some senior Labour and Liberal Democrat figures are reportedly even considering temporary suspension of royal privileges until a full investigation is complete. That is no longer a conspiracy theory. That is the constitutional equivalent of DEFCON 1. The government has not yet responded. The king has not spoken. Above all, the nation, under lockdown, silenced and plunged into darkness, waits for 9 p.m. for the broadcast for the truth. At precisely 9 p.m, every screen in Britain flickered, phones buzzed with alerts. Televisions automatically switched over. Streaming services paused. Radios cut to silence. Then came the emblem, the royal crest, etched in gold against a black background. No music, no narration. Just a still image followed by one line of white text. This address has been recorded by His Majesty the King under Article 4 of the Regency Emergency Clause. For most of the country, this was the first time they heard of such a clause. But for those in government media and military intelligence, this was the nuclear option. A legal and constitutional invocation, so rare it exists only in emergency protocols never made public. And now it had been used by the king against his own government silence. The screen then cut to video. King Charles III, seated alone in a royal study, stripped of regalia, unshaven, visibly aged from the day before. The air was heavy, the camera didn't move. No cuts, no angles, just His Majesty. And then he spoke. My fellow Britons, tonight I speak not as a sovereign above you, but as a citizen among you who has, like you, been faced with truths too long buried in silence. The room held its breath. For weeks now, information has surfaced, some of it long known within private circles, some of it newly revealed. I will not insult your intelligence by denying its existence, nor will I dishonour your trust by pretending I was unaware of its implications. He paused. There have indeed been moments in this institution's long history where expediency overtook transparency and where relationships with foreign actors were maintained in the belief that stability required silence. A silence fell over the nation. This wasn't a denial, it was the beginning of a confession. In the early years of a collapsing Soviet empire, efforts were made, by individuals now both named and unnamed, to secure economic channels which would, in theory, preserve British influence in an uncertain world. Not all these actions were formally sanctioned, not all of them were ethically sound, and some of them, I now understand, fully cast long shadows over the institution I now lead. A lump formed in the throats of millions watching. This wasn't any PR statement, this was unprecedented royal admission. As your king, I accept complete responsibility for the integrity of the crown. But as a man, I recognise the pain that secrecy breeds, and so, effective immediately, I hereby issue a royal declassification order releasing all non-security related documents referenced in what has now been termed the Scepter Archive. This, of course, will include private correspondences, financial records, and diplomatic summaries in respect to the monarchy's international engagements between 1988 and 2010. Gasps could be heard in newsrooms. Moreover, I have instructed my legal counsel to cooperate fully with any independent inquiry that Parliament or the courts may consider necessary. I have nothing to hide. I'm afraid of one thing only: the loss of public confidence, and it is that fear which inspires this moment. The address lasted 6 minutes. At the time, the king was not only legitimizing key Scepter Files, but acknowledging their moral weight. He admitted that the crown had erred, that diplomacy and influence had been bartered for silence, that secrets, when hidden too long, start to rot even the most hallowed institutions. But what came next shattered the final illusion of continuity. I am now prepared to step back from active royal duties pending the outcome of this investigation. The Prince of Wales shall act as regent under Clause 3 of the Royal Stabilisation Act. I will not rule over a kingdom in doubt of its king. In those final words, King Charles effectively suspended his own reign. He placed the crown into a form of constitutional stasis, a limbo state unknown in modern British history. There was no abdication, yet. But there was something even more shocking: accountability. When the screen faded to black, no one spoke in Parliament. No news anchor immediately analysed. No pundit shouted across screens. For the first time in years, Britain fell silent. Then came the reaction. Social media crashed under the load of traffic. Hashtags exploded. Number the king steps back, number crown crisis, number scepter reckoning across the nation. People wept, some in sorrow, others in disbelief. A few in relief somewhere. Behind the curtains of international connections, eyes were watching, cold, silent eyes, because even as the king spoke, a third and final archive had already started uploading to the dark web. The final phase, the most damning secrets, the ones which even Charles had not yet seen. At Saujodan Archetyphen, precisely Archetyphen Utis, after King Charles concluded the most consequential royal address in modern history, a new digital file began circulating on a decentralized, encrypted data den sharing network favored by whistleblowers and black den hat intelligence operatives. Unlike previous leaks, this one wasn't teased or announced. It didn't come with a press briefing or Kremlin threat. It simply appeared, its name blunt, chilling and unmistakable. Scepter Phase 3, Crown Without Consent. The cybersecurity experts who monitor the leak certainly noticed something immediately unusual, whereas prior drops had been manually compiled document scans and audio logs. This one was structured, categorized, programmatic, built like a case file, and most disturbingly, it appeared to have been assembled by someone inside a British government database. The metadata didn't point to Russia, it didn't point to a journalist, it pointed to a Department for International Trade workstation, then a login that had been inactive since Launsening Yishijo, allegedly due to a routine reassignment. But what was inside would detonate the final charge in this constitutional explosion. Among the treasure trove were classified reports from Liaotenli Nilfate, Liaotenli Zhou, outlining off the Gem books, financial transfers from offshore trust accounts allegedly linked to the Duchy of Cornwall, to that time managed by Prince Charles, to Shell Corporation's later Expo. Said as Russian economic fronts, one document highlighted how funds had been reinvested through London based holding companies and redirected into Eastern European energy infrastructure projects that would later be sanctioned by the UK itself. One email chain marked confidential eyes only fei royal discretion tier yi involved a Liaotenling T lobbying effort by unnamed senior royals and two lords from the House of Lords seeking to defeat a proposed transparency amendment which would require full public disclosure of foreign holdings by UK royals. The vote failed by 3 votes. The lobbyists won. But this leak didn't stop at politics or finance. What follows next in a shocking section labelled Monarch Engagement, Sensitive Intelligence Reference. There were internal notes describing alleged intelligence briefings given to then Prince Charles on foreign asset vetting procedures, briefings that would fall well outside of his ceremonial duty and suggest he was once used at least as an unofficial diplomatic vector. One chilling line from a Liaotenling Barmy summary reads, "The Prince has contacted third Dem party representatives outside official channels. Although not illegal, These actions establish a web of plausible deniability structures that could boomerang under scrutiny. Recommend urgent limitations on unsanctioned engagement. Now the nation knows those limitations never came. It was Sawushuden, and this last archive was being discussed in hushed tones across emergency meetings in Whitehall. Legal teams scrambled. Defense officials were reviewing public unrest scenarios. Social media platforms buckled under record user volumes. And the monarchy's official website came offline out for maintenance, a digital white flag. Inside Parliament MPs, many of whom stayed in for what had been expected to be a routine post-gen address debate and were now discussing openly next steps never spoken aloud in modern Britain, proposed a formal constitutional review of the monarchy's legal privileges. Others whispered what no one dared to say before tonight: we may need to consider suspension of royal authority pending investigation outcomes. For the first time in living memory, a functioning UK Parliament is seriously considering the procedural mechanisms of disempowering a monarch, not because of scandal, not because of ideology, but because the country is facing a trust collapse at the highest symbolic level. At Sawushuden, the head of the opposition appeared in a brief and serious press conference. His face was pale, his tone sharp. What we have witnessed in the past Shiraz is the unravelling of secrets that reach into the very architecture of British power. We will not inflame, we will not politicise, but we will not ignore. There must be a reckoning, and a reckoning there shall be. Outside Westminster, thousands gathered now in candlelight, demanding transparency, holding signs that read, "Tell us everything, no more secrets, country first, crown second." But perhaps the most chilling part of the Phase 3 leak wasn't the documents. It was the final attached note. No signature, no language. Just a time-stamped, encrypted string of characters that decoded to a single message. The files you have seen are not the worst. They are the ones we let you see. You decide your next move carefully. There is always a Phase 4. And so the distinction between foreign manipulation, domestic betrayal, and institutional collapse began to blur into something new, something darker, something irreversible. One more chapter remains. One final hour before the sun rises on a very different Britain by midnight. The United Kingdom was no longer a country in crisis. It was a country in transition, not the kind driven by elections or referendums or manifestos, but the kind driven by revelation, the kind no nation truly prepares for, the kind that tears through institutions like fire through dry timber, burning away ceremony, mythology, and inherited reverence until only one question remains: whom can we now trust? The final hours of the night were ones of consequences, not answers. In a sealed parliamentary chamber under emergency constitutional rules, a special bipartisan committee was set up, something called the Crown Integrity Review Panel. Its mandate was unprecedented: review all known Scepter archive materials, establish timeline and depth of royal entanglements, determine whether a crime was committed, and where necessary, whether temporary suspension or permanent restructuring of the monarchy was merited under British law. The very fact that such a panel now exists is history. Meanwhile, inside Sandringham, the royal estate remained sealed and guarded. No media, no staff. Only the most senior security liaisons remained inside with King Charles, who, according to unconfirmed reports, was now refusing all external contact. Not even Prince William, now acting as regent, had spoken with his father since the recording of the Sawushuden address. One palace aide, speaking off Jan record to an international reporter, said simply, "He's not in shock. He's in mourning, mourning the death of the old monarchy." Across the nation, dawn broke in silence. Streets that only days before had been filled with pomp, Christmas lights, and royal paraphernalia sat still under grey skies. Shopkeepers swung open their doors without playing the national anthem on their radios. School children logged into online classes with teachers unsure of what exactly to say. Pubs remained shut until further notice in most major cities. A general advisory from the Cabinet Office asks citizens to remain calm, remain informed, and refrain from mass gathering until further direction is given. Yet the internet still raged. Scepter Files had been trending for more than consecutive hours now, longer than any UK political trend on record. Not far behind were Faye acting Gradient, Fake Crown Crisis, and Faye Phase 4. But perhaps the most viral phrase of the morning was a simple one, printed on a cardboard sign held by a teenage girl outside Buckingham Palace at Shanwulilden. If this is our history, then let's finally write our own future. The world watched. CNN provided wall-to-den wall coverage. Al Jazeera ran hour den by den hour deep dives. RT and Sputnik predictably celebrated the chaos. France Archer documentary retrospective gen already titled The End of Royal Innocence. And in the United Nations, emergency security briefings were now being scheduled not about Ukraine, not about Gaza, but about the stability of the United Kingdom. A nuclear power now internally fractured by the collapse of its symbolic heart. But here's the most unexpected twist of all. By Shanwulilden, as news anchors dissected the leak, as protesters wept and ministers resigned, and silence echoed from Sandringham, something quietly changed in the public. The rage, real and justified, did not vanish, but something deeper began to replace it. Something older than monarchy, older than parliament, older than even the idea of Britain itself. Resolve. People started to organise, not riots, not revolts, but community meetings, digital councils, activist groups, civic leaders from all walks, teachers, doctors, veterans, engineers, calling for not just a reckoning but a renewal, a great reset. Not for an ideology, not for a political party, but for truth, for accountability, for a future where power is earned, not inherited, where trust is built on actions and not title. Because what had collapsed was not simply a crown. It was a myth that stated some truths are too dangerous for the people to know. And now, with secrets laid bare, with files exposed, and the old power structures trembling, the people of Britain exhausted, betrayed, awakened, stood blinking in the light of a new dawn. Not monarchists, not Republicans, not left, not right, just citizens. As the sun rises over a different kingdom, one bereft of illusion, but alive with possibility, the last words of the night, from the lips of a news anchor just before broadcast cut to silence, still hang in the air. This is not the end of the monarchy, but it may be the beginning of Britain.